Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos, and I'm going to start with a joke. What is the etiquette for entering the court of King Henry VIII? Oh, just Anne Boleyn. I'd like to say that joke was mine, but it isn't. I picked it up from the Adam and Joe radio programme a few years ago. It was submitted by a listener, and it's been one of my favourite jokes ever since. And it ushers us today into this episode of Musical Talk, which is all about Tudor musicals, and one in particular. Now, the Tudors are, if you like, the show business dynasty of the British royal family, or probably more accurately, the English royal family as it was at that time. We've all seen films and dramas and indeed musicals about almost every person connected with the Tudors in some way over the years. I don't need to tell you that Six is the toast of the town. It's a very popular musical about the six wives of Henry VIII. It started at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and of course has stormed the West End and the world. Another musical about Henry VIII's six wives, which was also on at the Edinburgh Fringe a few years ago, and you may have heard me mention this in previous episodes of Musical Talk, was called Half a Dozen. And it also looked at the role of the six wives of Henry VIII, although in a very different way. And of course, possibly the granddaddy of them all in some ways, at least in terms of musical theatre, is the probably almost now forgotten musical by the legendary Richard Rodgers from 1976, called Rex, which was about the life of Henry VIII and in particular his search for a male heir. Now, it's quite interesting actually the way that the wives of Henry VIII are portrayed in these different musicals. In Six, it's all about liberating those characters in a way from history. In Half a Dozen, the approach was slightly lower key and perhaps more analytical and certainly more historically detailed than in Six. Now, on the night I went to see it, unfortunately, Edinburgh flu had overtaken one of the cast, and being an Edinburgh show, they didn't have an understudy. So a difficult decision was made by the director to take out one of the wives and have the actress play into the role vacated by the actress who was ill. In this case, it meant that Catherine Howard did not appear in the performance that evening, and the actress who played her stepped in to play Anne Boleyn, the role that had become vacant. And I think history would tell us that Anne Boleyn is probably more important than Catherine Howard. However, interestingly, I think, in Rex, we also meet 5 of the 6 wives of Henry VIII as that story unfolds. But for some reason, the unlucky wife, in terms of not appearing, is Anne of Cleves. The plot seems to whisk past her and just mentions her in retrospect. So there are 3 musicals just related to the life of Henry VIII, let alone the rest of the Tudor dynasty. And listeners who have long memories, but perhaps short tempers, will also remember a musical about Elizabeth I a few years ago at the Edinburgh Festival Fringe called Liz, which was a light-hearted romp, but which caught my attention because it set the Tilbury speech, the famous speech that Elizabeth I made at the time of the Spanish Armada, where she famously stated that she had the body of a woman but the stomach and heart of a king. For me, it was fascinating to hear that kind of, primary source document from history being set to music so successfully. It's really quite a striking thing to do and stood out from the rest of that musical. So there's just a handful of musicals related to the Tudor dynasty, and there are plenty more. But none of them, of course, use genuine Elizabethan music. And why should they? We don't expect authenticity in musical styles for any kind of musical set in the past, as almost all of them are. And the proof of the pudding there is Hamilton, and indeed Six. But there's also a different reason, which we'll explore a little more in today's episode, which is that Elizabethan music seems more alien to us than, say, Victorian music. And that is because the way we relate to music and the way music itself has developed has meant there's a cultural disconnect now. So, whilst we know what Elizabethan music is, it's much harder to enjoy and appreciate, because it sounds just that little bit too different to what we're used to. Within 100 years of the Tudor dynasty ending in 1603, music had transformed into a version that we would recognise today and can just plug ourselves into immediately without having to, if you like, recalibrate our understanding and engagement. I find this quite fascinating. It was a sea change in music. So where am I leading you with this? Well, that's a very good question. This week and next week, as part of our extended Edinburgh Festival Fringe coverage, we are going to look back at two musicals put on in consecutive years by a very talented man by the name of David William Hughes. You may remember the name because he has appeared on the programme before. This week, you're going to hear about his one-man show from the 2018 Edinburgh Festival Fringe called Elizabethan. And it's really about Elizabethan and Jacobean music, and we will discuss in this interview how that music is different to what we understand today, but how it can still be brought to life in the hands of an engaging practitioner. And I must tell you that David William Hughes is that man. And we're going to be able to offer you up something we simply don't get to do very much here on Musical Talk, and that is offer you a sequel. Because in this conversation, which I recorded with him in 2018, you will hear us talking about what his then plans were for the next Edinburgh Festival show for 2019. It was a show called Wit and Mirth, and it essentially pushed the calendar on about a century and dealt with music from a later era. Well, I caught up with David William Hughes in 2019 and saw that secondary show, Wit and Mirth, and loved it as I had loved Elizabethan. And so I recorded an interview with him after one of the evening performances of that show. For reasons lost in the history of time, I've never yet been able to broadcast that interview. So that brings us back to this week and next. Today, you'll hear the 2018 interview with David about Elizabethan, which we'll then also talk about next week's episode, which is his later show, Wit and Mirth. So you can hear two episodes separated by a year in terms of recording, which talk about how one man brought two very distinct and yet two fabulous shows to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in succession. Well, that's quite enough waffling on from me, I'm sure you'll agree. Let's get down to the meat and potatoes, as Thomas Fatswaller would have it, of today's episode. In just a minute, you're going to hear a song sung for you by David Hughes, which is an original Elizabethan song. And then you'll hear that interview I recorded with David in 2018 about his wonderful show, Elizabethan.
Tobacco, tobacco, sing sweetly for tobacco. Tobacco is like love, oh, love it, for you see, I will prove it. Love maketh lean the fat man's tumour, so doth tobacco. Love still dries up the wanton humour, so doth tobacco. Love makes men sail from shore to shore, so doth tobacco. 'Tis fond love often makes men poor, so doth tobacco. Love makes men scorn all coward fears, so doth tobacco. Love often sets men by the ears, so doth tobacco. Tobacco, tobacco, sing sweetly for tobacco. Tobacco is like love, oh, love it, for you see, I have proved it.
I'm David William Hughes, and my show is called Elizabethan.
Now, I loved your show. I thought it was witty, I thought it was funny, I thought it was intelligent, and I thought it worked on so many different levels at the same time. I was completely captivated by it. But I think I'd like to ask you to briefly explain what the show is for other people who might also be captivated by it.
The summary of the show in a brief form is it's a brand new musical, but all the songs are 400 years old. So it's all based on genuine 16th and 17th century lute songs, most of which were published...
Can I just say lute and not lewd?
Lute. Some of them are lewd.
Lewd is also possible.
Some of them are lewd, but they're all lute songs, which were all published in England between 1580 and 1620. And I've performed these songs many times before in concert settings, you know, sort of serious music setting, but they're all, or most of them, are quite funny, witty, bawdy, stupid in some cases. And I thought what I wanted to do with this show is really bring that out and bring them into a funny context where people can feel free to laugh at them, because I think originally they were intended to be laughed at and enjoyed in a sort of drunken, slightly silly way, rather than kind of
just
in a
like The
stage.
Fringe.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've had this idea for a while of, if you like, a jukebox musical, to use an anachronistic
exactly
term.
what it is, yes.
A jukebox musical of Renaissance music. So that was sort of going around in my head, and I've also wanted for a while to do a solo show at the Fringe, because I've been in other people's shows and in group shows before, but I never quite had the right idea. And I think if you're coming to the Fringe, you better have a good idea,
Indeed.
because otherwise you're lost. So I was at the Fringe last year and saw two shows which really inspired me, neither of which were actually musical. One was this show called Droll by a company called Owl Scream Theatre, who put on these skits and plays that were performed originally during the interregnum in England in the 17th century when theatre was banned. So they're these kind of very bawdy, messy, sort of bastard versions of Shakespeare and things like that.
Is it Shakespeare as remembered rather than as actually is, isn't it?
It's sort
partly.
of, it's all Shakespeare. It's kind of the greatest hits of Shakespeare. So for example, there's a Macbeth one, which is entirely the gravedigger scene from Macbeth, and there's a Midsummer Night's Dream one, which is just all about bottom, and there's no fairies or anything really about that. So it's kind of just jokey, just fun, very silly. And the other show was a fantastic one-man show by a man called Graham Dixon, which was called The Narcissist.
Oh, right.
Which was a sort of meta-theatrical exploration of character degeneration, and it was a fantastic show, and a really just interesting to see this one character sort of dissolve before your eyes. So,
It's like an onion peeling itself.
yeah, and those sort of inspired me last year. So I went away and started researching songs, and some of the songs in the show I've been singing for many years, but I thought, okay, well, we need to delve. You can't just have all love songs in a show, right? So I went through tons of books in the library, tons of publications, played a lot, looked at recordings, and gradually this theme came out, which is dying of love, because this is a common theme in poetry of the time. And I thought, well, okay, then how do you die of love? How is that possible? So our main character, a guy called Tobias Bacon, he's died of love. 400 years later, he's back as a ghost to try and work out how. And I won't tell you how he managed to die of love, because that's the big surprise at the end of the show.
But that's our frameworking device that allows the songs
That's our
in.
frameworking
but also
device.
a very successful frameworking device in its own right. It's not just a prop for the songs. It's actually engaging for the hour of the show.
Yeah, and there's various ways in which you might die of love. So one common sort of metaphor of the time is that the little death is the orgasm. So is that dying of love? There's obviously actual death, and then we find out how he really died, and of course that's another matter. And then in terms of framing the show, he basically falls in love with three people, and that's in my mind kind of like a Goldilocks story.
Yes.
It's like the first person is too much one way, the second person is too much something else, the third person is just right, and then in a sort of Bluebeard's castle reveal, he just dies at the end.
Yes.
So it's a kind of
It's almost pathetic in the end, isn't it, in that sense?
It's kind of... Yeah, I mean, what easier way to end the show than just kill the main character, right? So, but then I basically wanted... The other sort of final input to the show is... So I mainly sing classical music as a countertenor, so in an alto range, but I can also sing as a baritone. So then I can have these two distinct voice ranges, a male voice range and a sort of female voice range, and play those off against each other, and yeah.
It's a one-man show, but it's not a one-character show by
No,
any means,
that's
is it?
right.
Yeah.
So
quite a lot of versatility on display.
There are four other characters. Tobias's father makes a brief appearance, and he's played by the entire audience. And then there are Tobias's three lovers, which are sometimes played by members of the audience, and then I play myself, and sometimes they play me, and I play them. So you get a lot of back and forth, and again, it's sort of that Shakespearean bad disguise type of thing.
It's all hats, really.
It's basically hats and wigs, yeah. There's a line in the show which is, we know who the characters are by what headgear they're wearing. So that adds an element of surprise as well. I think... part of my background, apart from being a musician, is I've done a lot of improv, and so it's nice to have that sort of slightly unexpected element in the show as well.
Well, funny enough, I think that comes across in spades, actually, because you seem very comfortable in front of an audience and you seem very comfortable engaging with an audience. And even here in Edinburgh, where that's much more common than in other kinds of theatre, shall we say, or other venues, there still can be a reticence in an audience. So you do seem to have a way of getting people up.
Yeah, that's been one of the challenges, actually, in Edinburgh is... I think maybe because the show's billed as a musical rather than a straight-up comedy show, people don't come expecting to shout stuff out. So I have to sort of warm up at the beginning to try and get people in the mood, and then I sort of try and draw people out. And sometimes that comes from, you can see a bit from the stage, if someone's giggling a lot, they're probably up for it.
They're in.
And by the end of the show, I can usually figure out during the show who the last person is going to be, because either the most embarrassed or the most silly. Sometimes you get gifted. One show recently, I was chatting to someone as part of the intro spiel, and they said they were an actor. So I was like, well, obviously we have to get this guy up. And
sometimes the gods work in your favour.
Yeah, and then one show, the first person volunteered very enthusiastically. It turned out they were French and didn't really understand English. So
Brilliant.
that added another sort of level of confusion to proceedings.
A bit of meta fun, in
Yeah.
fact. Let's talk about the music, though, because can I say, I love the piece all the way through. I think, as I said, it's clever and witty, and I want to talk about some of the references, some of the unusual and unexpected references that you insert here and there. But funnily enough, there is a golden thread of sincerity throughout the piece, even though it's a comedy. And at the very end, when you're addressing the audience, once the show is completed, I'll tell you what comes across really profoundly is your genuine love and your genuine enthusiasm for the musical material that you're offering us. But it seems to be a sort of cry from the heart, but what you really want to do is open up this wonderful and unfortunately now sort of closed world of Elizabethan Tudor, early Stuart music. So your passion comes through.
Yeah, that's my... Renaissance music is kind of a huge passion of mine, and I do it a lot. I direct a Renaissance choir in Boston, and we mainly do serious music with some sort of silly stuff as well. And I sing a lot of that stuff, and I love it, and I think it's beautiful and amusing and heart-rending, but it's a different musical world from the sort of standard world that we are used to listening to on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, we do.
So I think a lot of people, and I teach music as well, and this is for my students as well, it's difficult to access that music because it's making use of a musical and textual frame of reference that's no longer in use. So how do you get around that? And I think what I try to do in lots of things I do is make that music accessible. So sometimes that's with the choir I direct, we program works in a way where they're accessible. So with reference to a theme, or putting old works in combination with more modern works that use similar material or something like that.
Variations on the theme.
Yeah,
Strange
that
way,
sort of thing. And then with this piece, it's really about, can we make this music funny for anyone on the street rather than just the Renaissance music nerd? Yeah. And I think it's working. People are coming to see it. People are laughing. I've had a couple of people come up to me after the show and say, "Oh, I've never really explored this music before." I've had a couple of people get in touch by email and say, "Can you recommend good recordings of these songs?" And that's been really cool. So
it is working.
Yeah, and I think the story of the show doesn't really have much seriousness in it. But if there is a serious point, it's that I want to make this music accessible. I want to bring it to a larger audience and just bring it out of
retirement.
Well, yeah, I mean, people are performing this, and there's some fantastic performers. If you ever get a chance to listen to Yestin Davies' recordings of these songs, he just fairly recently did an album and a tour, and he's just a beautiful singer, and he does bring out the humour fantastically. But I wanted to kind of, maybe be the point where someone will hear this, and then they'll go and listen to Yestin Davies doing it better than I can, or something like that. And yeah.
A leaping on point in some senses.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, obviously, you've already explained that this is a big part of your life elsewhere professionally in the other parts of your non-Edinburgh life, if such a thing can ever be said to exist. But I suppose what I'd like to say is it's quite interesting for me as someone who doesn't know very much about it because the songs are done absolutely sincerely, although they're witty in their own right.
Yes.
So you allow the songs to speak for themselves. There's no sort of hamming up or sending up of the songs. The underlay of the framework is heightened. But the songs themselves are allowed to speak for what they are, and some are tremendously funny, some are baldy. Witty is the word you used on the night, and I think witty is the word. But I was just looking at it almost mechanistically, if you like, that you play the lute as you sing, which is a wonderful thing to see, by the way, I must say. But obviously when people sing songs, even now, usually the melody line is not played. But it's certainly clear to me that when you were singing it, you were mostly strumming chords and singing the melody line above it. I suppose what I'm sort of grasping at is, would you say the techniques of singing those songs, are they vastly different from a modern day singing technique? You know, if you were standing up there with an electric, maybe not electric guitar, an acoustic guitar, would you find it very different?
It really depends on the song and the composer. So the opening song of the show is called Tobacco, Tobacco, which is by a guy called Tobias Hume. And that, in the original version, is very strummy. It's basically just chord, 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 and singing over the top. And he even says in the intro to his publication, look, most lute music is far too complicated. I want to write something for the common man to sing. This is really simple, anyone can do it. So there's that.
It's got a good bass line.
Yeah, but then there are songs where, for example, the Dowland songs like Flow My Tears or Dear If You Change, where the lute part is contrapuntal and there's sort of hints of second and third melody lines in the lute part. And you might just say that Dowland's a better composer.
More sophisticated, certainly.
But definitely he's musically more sophisticated. But the thing is, you read treatises on lute playing and you look at the scores, and a lot of the time the lute part is kind of hammed up. So a lot of these songs come published in more than one version. So there are kind of three typical formats for these songs. One is lute and voice. One is 4 voices, so more of a choral arrangement. And the other one is a lute potentially accompanying with a voice, and then viols, so like the ancestor of the violin and cellos, playing counter melodies as well. And often if you compare the lute part to the sort of the viol parts of the choral parts, you'll see vestiges of that in there, but because of the physical structure of the lute, you can't play 4 different melodies at once. So they sort of choose what's most important or what fits under the hand most easily, and they kind of figure that out. And then you can also find, at the time, for songs that weren't published with a lute, someone else will come along and make a lute part for it.
And lute it.
Yeah, and you can see that the conception of the song was pretty fluid. There wasn't necessarily a specific way to perform it.
Yes.
And so, as the person putting on the show, one of the songs I've rocked up a bit and made it a little bit inauthentic to get that energy out. But I think, at the time, we don't know how these would have exactly sounded. We have the sheet music, but obviously there's no recordings.
It's all in the performance, isn't it?
Yeah, and so there's lots of different ways to do it. And I'm sure at the time, if you had a great lutenist, probably would have done a really complicated part. If you had some crappy lutenist in a pub somewhere, or even without a lute playing some kind of, I don't know, washboard or something.
Something a bit more rusty.
Probably just did what they could, and what was available with the instruments. And so it's much, certainly at that time, the conception of a musical work was much more fluid, and you could, in the same way that you get your Beatles chord chart off the internet and you can do whatever you like with it. It's a bit like that with these. And I think the other thing to say in terms of comparing it to guitar is all these songs, when they're published for lute, the lute part is written in tab. So if anyone plays guitar, tab is a system where instead of writing the notes out on a score, you actually just have a system of lines which represent the strings of the guitar and numbers to tell you where to put your fingers. And on the lute part, it's the same. The only difference is instead of numbering the positions 1, 2, 3, 4, they number them with letters, so it's A, B, C, D. But the system is exactly the same. So you don't really even need to be able to read music to play these lute parts, which is kind of interesting.
It's a fingerboarding option almost, isn't
it? It's kind of a tablature, yeah.
This is very, very interesting. And so, forgive me then, obviously the next question I suspect must be about tempi. Presumably there is no record of the tempo that a particular song will be at which it will be sung. So you're free to make those decisions. And you said you spoke about zizzing one up a little bit.
Yeah.
But actually, there's no reason to believe it wouldn't have been sung at a faster or slower tempo, depending on what the audience required.
No, I mean, there aren't really tempo markings in the music, so you can do whatever you like. Some songs suggest that they should be slower. Some songs are faster. Some songs have a little note that says maybe they're referring to a type of dance, so that this can be a pavan. which we know is a slow type of dance, or this could be a galliard, which we know is a fast type of dance.
So it gives you a hint.
It gives you a clue on some of the songs, but some of them there's nothing at all. And as a performer as well, so, you know, I'm performing at the Fringe in a sort of very acoustically dead theatre, which means you can actually go quite fast and people can still hear the words.
Yes.
But I've also done the songs in very resonant spaces like a church, which you need to go slower because it's more echoey.
Yeah.
And if people are going to hear the words, you can't just speak really fast. So it just really depends on a lot of things.
And it's interesting, isn't it? Because the songs are... I love lyrics. You know, I'm more of a words person than a music person because I understand words better than I understand music. So I'm an amateur, but love it musically. But the song is entirely these Elizabethan songs are still lyrically meaningful, and as you say, some are more sophisticated than others.
The poetry is just fantastic. I mean, it's quite hard to get the full depth of the poetry on one listening.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I'm trying to do in the show is to provide enough context that people know what the song is about, even if they don't grasp every word.
You sort of embedded it, haven't you?
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, I mean, probably the best poetry are in the songs by Thomas Campion, and his poems are just sublime and witty, and it's just this kind of, I don't know, you know, it's the time of Shakespeare, and it's the time of all these other great poets like Johnson or Marlowe or something like that, and
it's a great period of literature.
It's a kind of outpouring, and it's almost the furthest back you can go in English literature and song and still be able to fully understand it. I've done a few songs
apart from Summer Is a Coming In.
Summer Is a Coming In, and there's a few songs from the generation before, kind of Henry VIII sort of time, and you understand half the words, and then half of them are sort of a bit obscure and lost. So it's kind of a nice point text-wise.
Well, funnily enough, it is, isn't it? I mean, that outpouring is quite the right word of literature. Also, sort of solidifies meaning, and meaning is never solidified, but it in some way the written word is then handed down more than the oral tradition, I suppose, is the best way of putting it, and therefore the words retain their meaning.
Yeah.
Accessibility is retained, I suppose, is what I'm lurching towards in that clumsy sentence.
A lot of these composers sort of fall out of fashion pretty soon after they die. You've then got the great upheaval of the Civil War and
repression.
And the repression
culture.
And then the Restoration rolls around and people are interested in new things. And some composers like Henry Purcell take up some of the tradition from before and reuse it going forward, but some composers are just forgotten about. Some people like Thomas Campion, he wrote a textbook of how to write music, and for a couple of hundred years he was mainly known as an author of this textbook rather than a composer. Yeah. And then really, I suppose in the sort of late 19th century, people started getting reacquainted with this music because they were looking for some kind of national tradition.
A historic golden age.
Yeah, and then in the early 20th century it really takes off. There's a guy called Edmund Fellows who was a scholar who was the first person to create sort of comprehensive modern editions of a lot of this music. And then kind of in the 50s and 60s people really started performing it a lot. So two people that are important, Alfred Deller, a great singer, he sort of brings all this to life, and then Benjamin Britten, of course, reworked a lot of this music, made editions of it, popularised it, that kind
famously
of thing.
Famously loved Purcell as well.
Exactly.
Course, yeah.
So it's really kind of revived in the 20th century after being sort of lost for a couple of hundred years.
That's rather wonderful in its way, and I love that you're part of that movement in your own. You're thrusting to get it back.
I think I'm trying to go a little more pop culture with it, and who knows if that will be successful. But yeah, I'm trying to get it out there.
I'll ask you one more question about the music for the time being, if I may, and that's from your own personal point of view. It's a fairly reductive question, but sometimes it can be instructive, which is, what is your sort of favourite song that you have selected? Because obviously, as you say, the genre, if you can call it that, the canon may be a better way of putting it, is enormous. You've had to distill it down to a number of songs for this show.
Yeah, we've got 10 songs in the show. I think my favourite is a song called Lady If You So Spite Me, which is by John Dowland, and it's all about how can you, sort of classic lost love, how can you be so cruel to me, woman? Very pathetic in a way, but musically it's probably one of the most interesting songs because it doesn't repeat any sections. It was one of the last pieces that Dowland wrote, and it was actually published by his brother after his death. And it reminds me a lot of Monteverdi. It's got sort of repetitions of lines, very free-flowing, real sense of tension and release in the melody and harmony, and it's just a bit more complicated than the others. If I had to choose a favourite, I'd go for that one.
And of course he has that, all the songs actually have recognisable modern themes. I mean, if you just look at pop music, as you say, the very song we were talking about is, Woman, What Have You Done To Me? Is a trope we've seen for 50, 60 years in pop.
I mean...
And historically further that? Yes.
I mean, you go back as far as any sort of surviving poetry, and people are always moaning about how somebody doesn't like them. Yeah. This is kind of a perennial theme. But there was also this sort of fashion in the Elizabethan times of being sad, and to a certain extent, I think...
Died of melancholy.
Yes. Being almost like a sort of the emo movement. It's kind of like... it was cool to be unhappy. It wasn't cool to be, boisterous and merry all the time. And it was kind of seen as refined to be tragic. So, there's been a lot written about, was this a reflection of so-and-so's personal life? And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But it was certainly a la mode to be upset.
Now, we've been talking very... interestingly, actually, if I may say, about the music and the songs you've selected, but actually your show is absolutely jam-packed with pop and less popular cultural references.
Yeah.
I mean, just to pick two, there's a reference to Rousseau, the artist. People will probably remember The Tiger in the Jungle in the Rain is the most famous of his pictures. And of course, no, I don't think many people spotted it on the day, but you very drolly quoted I'm a Barbie girl.
Yep.
That's pretty much, it's from A to Z is pretty much available here.
So, I mean, there's the serious part of the show, which is the music, but then the rest is basically me having fun and thinking up what would be funny. And I spent a whole day sort of sitting at home one day writing metaphors and similes for how could you describe sexiness in a funny way, trying to sort of stick in these stupid references to Barbie girl and things like that. And, Rousseau, totally anachronistic, a funny thing that pops into mind. And
but there's a lot of wordplay as well, because, forgive me, you make great play about comparing attractive women to trees.
Yes.
And of course, then, you pay off with willowy.
Yeah.
And I don't think everyone always makes the connection, but it seemed...
I just kind of, I mean, it's sort of, comedically, I mean, Blackadder is a great influence, and you got, that's the classic Elizabethan sitcom, obviously, and then just that, that idea of, in Shakespeare and so forth, you have all these metaphors for everything. Everything is described with metaphor or simile, and to just sort of have fun with that by comparing stuff to stuff that's totally irrelevant, or... Yeah, that's a great way to have fun comedically, and it's just kind of enjoyable.
But the show is therefore organic, isn't it? Because as you're enjoying yourself, you're thinking of new references and perhaps letting other references go if they don't hit the spot. So how has the show changed, even just in the Edinburgh run?
The Edinburgh run. So the first couple...
We're a couple of weeks in as we record.
Yeah, we're 2 weeks in. I changed it a lot after the first two performances. I performed it in the States, and I did a preview in London, which went really well. And then I brought it to the Fringe, and perhaps because it's listed in the musical section rather than the comedy section, I think people weren't entirely expecting a comedy, and so they weren't sure, should I laugh at this or not? So I kind of added in a new opening monologue, which makes it very clear, yes, this is a comedy, you're supposed to laugh, you're supposed to shout stuff out. The more interaction we can have, the better it is.
You set out your stall.
Yeah, and in some ways that feels... in some ways it feels like, oh man, do I really have to do this? But on the other hand, it makes the show better later on.
Yes.
And I think that's the key thing. It's almost like, go see a stand-up show, and the first act, all they do is chat to the audience to get you warmed up. And you need that in a show you need 5 minutes for people to sort of settle in, and then when they're comfortable, when they feel like, no, you build a bit of a relationship, then you can start to have fun with the sort of more meaty stuff in the show.
And you can surf the atmosphere of the room a bit as well.
Yeah, and you can see what's going on, and building a relationship with the audience, and before you take them somewhere uncomfortable, get them comfortable first. So that's
That's a beautiful sentence.
That's been one thing, but then on the reverse side, it's been really interesting in Edinburgh to do it every day, and every day different bits are found funny by different people. So you'll get a joke, and one day it hits a spot and everyone's laughing, and then there'll be another joke that no one gets, and then the next day it's totally opposite, and people are getting one thing and the other. And I guess that's just who comes to the show, what's their frame of reference, what do they find funny. And I hope that in the show there's enough jokes on, there's some just very silly, crude jokes, there's some a bit more intellectual, there's some incredibly niche jokes, and hopefully there's something for everyone in there. And depending on who sees the show, they might like different stuff. So,
what kind of audience have you been getting? Because beginning the day I went, I had a sense, obviously I didn't do any formal analysis, but just from the people you were sort of talking to, there was a sense that the room was very much full of American tourists.
I think there is something that appeals to Americans about the Shakespearean era, and they love it.
It's a kind of golden age, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm also listed in the programme as being an American company because, although I'm British, I live in America, so I don't know, maybe that has something to do with it. The audience have been varied. It seems there's kind of two types. There are people who come for the comedy, and they love all the jokes.
Yes.
And then sometimes you'll get an audience that really is there for the music. And they won't laugh so much, but you'll get a big round of applause after every song, and people are sitting there like in a concert, closing their eyes, listening to this music. And I guess, fair enough,
It's a sensory delight for them.
Yeah, and it's great. I mean, as long as people are enjoying the show, I don't really mind how they do it.
Yeah. But isn't that interesting? Because it is a curious hybrid in the sense of that it is a very funny show, from first to last, with these moments of sincere, let the music speak for itself, and it does, and that's wonderful in its own way. But that's not a combination people often get. And then, of course, there's, as you say, there's the put your hand into the lucky dip of references which are going to come flying your way, and see which ones you respond to, as an audience. That's one of the things I liked about it. I think it is a show unlike any other show, and that is very much a good thing.
Yeah, I think. One thing I like about the show is its uniqueness. You come to the Fringe and it's mad. It's the biggest arts festival in the world. 5,000 or something performances a day. What's going to make you stand out? And that's why I think you need to have a good idea if you're coming to the Fringe. Come to the Fringe, it's another man doing stand-up for an hour, who cares?
And we've all seen the last 5 years far too often. It's a lovely show, but goodness, there's always 3 performances. It's a Jason Robert Brown musical, but it's some things come back year after year after year.
I think there is a niche in Edinburgh for new musicals. There are a few, but often the musical section of the programme is, Sweeney Todd and stuff like that. And fair enough,
but
we've seen it before. And I think that's been an advantage just in terms of being a bit more unique. On the other hand, do people find the show? I don't know. Marketing is just this whole other thing. I'm not an expert at it, but I'm doing it, and it's kind of pot luck. I've had days where I thought, it's really rainy today, no one's going to turn out. I haven't sold many pre-sales, and then it's a packed house. And then other days, very few people in. I think that's just pot luck of Edinburgh, really.
And it's true for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's a hard thing as a performer to get over that, and to realise the number of people in your show is not a judgment on its quality.
Oh goodness, no, and particularly in Edinburgh, where you are fighting for, there's lots of people here, but there's still only a limited number of people.
And I think a lot of us are used to, when I do a show typically in Boston or something like that, I'll be preparing a concert for a few months, and I'll do one performance, and then obviously a lot of people come because it's the one chance to see it. Whereas in Edinburgh, it's like you're doing it every day.
You've got 3 weeks opportunity.
Yeah, people are not necessarily all going to come at once, and so it's, as a performer, that's a really different discipline to be in. And in terms of, you need to sort of pace yourself over the 3 weeks. It's a lot to do, but it's also really great because you get that opportunity to do it again and again and again. You really get to see what works. You get to, I mean, just the physical act of singing for an hour every day is, you know, that's good for you.
It is.
Requires
therapeutic.
but it also trains you. You know, if you can sing every day for an hour, doing one concert is really easy, right?
Of course, yes.
So it's a great thing. And also the other thing about coming here is just being inspired by other stuff, and that, you know, you never anywhere else get the opportunity to go out and see so many things. I love going also to stuff at the International Festival,
yes,
because for classical music that's just wonderful.
Nothing to beat it, really. Yeah.
Seeing some of the best comedy. In terms of comedy as well, there are other shows like mine in that they're weird and wacky, and you wouldn't see them at a comedy club on a Saturday night in most places. And it's a chance for people to do stuff that's experimental, and of course some of it fails, but some of it's great as well.
But you've got to experiment.
Yeah,
haven't you?
I think Edinburgh's wonderful for that, in that you can actually do stuff that's weird, and there are people who will come and see it, and you can get feedback on it as well. You know, you can get reviews are a case in point. You know, you could normally a show that you do, you might get one review, and it's either good or bad, and you're like, well, okay. But in Edinburgh, you know, you might get 6 or 8 reviews over the month, and you get to see, okay, if you get one review and it's like 2 stars, you think, oh. If you get one review and you think 5 stars, you think, oh great. But actually, if you get lots of reviews and it's like, oh, all of them around the 3, 4 or 4, 5 star area, okay, actually this means something. It's a collected opinion. So
yes, it's not just a snapshot.
And I think the quality of reviewers in Edinburgh that I've had, in the main, have been pretty good. And certainly I had a couple of reviews early in the run which had some really useful points in it, which I've actually tried to put into the show. And so one review was saying, you know, great show, but you know, he seems to be too worried about the jokes and not enough on the music. And I was thinking, well, that's interesting. And I guess sometimes you're worried if people aren't laughing, but in a show with great music in it, actually what you need to do is just sing the music really well, and then who cares if people laugh? You know, they'll enjoy the music. So that was a really helpful piece of feedback from a review. And in Edinburgh, you get to put that into practice, because most of the time when you get reviews, you do a concert, get a review, and you're like, oh, well, I'm never going to do that again then.
It's nothing more than a full stop on the end of that process, isn't it?
I mean,
but as you say, here it's live, as it were. So.
Yeah, and you can respond to it, you can change the show a little bit and stuff like that. Yeah, it's really good practice.
Are there any cultural references? Because, you know, forgive me, you're a man of intense intelligence and knowledge in your own right. No, it's very clear. I mean, it comes through. But are there any references you've had to dump just because they're so esoteric? Or
I mean, not really dump, but there are some references that I have a sort of backup line to. So, for example, the Henri Rousseau joke, the joke is, oh, I was as naive as a painting by Henri Rousseau. And sometimes people laugh a lot at that, and then sometimes no one laughs. Yes. And so the backup line is to say afterwards, well, perhaps as naive as someone who thinks a reference to Henri Rousseau would be a good idea in a show.
Which we got on the day I came.
Yeah, and that's a great thing, because it's like, it's win-win, right? Either people get the joke and it's great, or they don't, and you've got another one to stick in. And having a lot of, as I worked on the show in America and also here, just building up a repertory of potential ad-libs for different moments is good.
Possible responses.
And because as it were. Yeah, you never know quite what the response is going to be, and then if you can put people at their ease, it's like, you know, some people might think, oh, I don't really know who Henri Rousseau is, and then you can tell the second joke and they're like, oh, I wasn't supposed to know anyway. You know, it puts people at their ease, I suppose. And yeah, so I don't know. I think also it's fine to have references that no one gets, because, you know, it doesn't really matter. Just stick it in there anyway.
Someone might one day.
Yeah. I was telling you earlier, I think, when we were getting the coffees, that there's one joke that only one person has ever got, and that person was a professor of 17th century English literature. So it's kind of pretty niche, but then again, who cares, you know?
But it's fantastic that it has been clocked.
It's been clocked once. So who knows, maybe it will be again. And hopefully there's enough richness there that people can find stuff in the show.
So, David, do you have a website? How can people find out more from you? Because obviously you're not based in Britain.
I'm not based in Britain.
But this is sort of this is part of your wider interest in this music and deliverance and performance of that music. So people might be interested on both sides.
Absolutely. The best way to find out more is to go to my website, which is davidwilliamhughes.org. Not .com. That's been taken.
Oh, has it?
But there's no actual website at that address, rather annoyingly. So davidwilliamhughes.org, and on there's links to recordings I've made, links to the choir I conduct, other projects I've been involved in. There's links to social media and my email address if you want to get in touch on there as well. So that's really the one-stop shop for everything. Yeah.
And finally, is there any future for Elizabethan? It's a fantastic show. Or will you put it in a box perhaps to bring out another time?
I think after this run, I want to take a break from it. And I think I've learned a lot from doing this show that I perhaps want to put into another project. But there's definitely other places I want to perform. One thing I want to do is, in Boston, there's a big early music festival, which also has its own fringe.
Oh, does it? Fantastic.
So they have kind of all these big performances of Baroque operas and stuff, and then there's all these little performances at the side. So that will be happening next June. It's every 2 years, the festival. So I want to try and perform there. And then I think, this has been a great process to create the show, and I kind of want to create something else. So I have a couple of germs of ideas in there, and I really want to come back to the Fringe next year, perhaps with something else, perhaps with not a one-man show, with a two-hander or something, because it would be fun to be on stage with a friend. So, yeah.
Well, I look forward to it. Obviously, you're avoiding the obvious sequel of Jacobean.
I don't want to do the same idea again. There's potential. You could potentially do a sort of Civil War one, which might be quite fun.
Yes.
But I mean, maybe. We'll see. We'll see. I've got some ideas up my sleeve, so we'll see what happens.
David, it's been a real pleasure talking to you. It was
Likewise.
a real delight to see your show.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been great to talk.
Come again, sweet love doth now invite thy graces that refrain to do me new delight, to see, to hear, to touch, to kiss, to die with thee again in sweetest sympathy. Come again, that I may cease to mourn through thy unkind disdain, for now left and forlorn. I sit, I sigh, I weep, I faint, I die in deadly pain, a endless misery. Gentle love, draw forth thy wounding dart. Thou canst not pierce my heart, for I that do approve. By sighs and tears more hot than thy shafts did tempt while you for triumph laughed. My sighs and tears more hot than my shafts did tempt while you for triumph laughed.
Well, there we are, another song sung for you marvellously by David William Hughes, who is a fantastic performing artist and can perform early music and comedy and base it on historical research. And as you heard, in that conversation, we spoke about what he was planning to bring to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe in 2019. That was a show called Wit and Mirth, and so next week you can hear an as yet unbroadcast interview with David about that fantastic show and also hear some of the songs. That is an exciting prospect for me, I think. And if you're interested, go along to see David's own website, www.davidwilliamhughes.org. And there you can find a wealth of material about David, including his academic work, but also his performance. And it includes some videos of some of his performances. So it's well worth a visit. Well, that brings this week's episode of Musical Talk to an end. And I hope you'll agree that we tried, at least, to put the glory into Gloriana. And that, of course, is another Speech Marks musical about a member of the Tudor dynasty. It was Benjamin Britten's opera about Elizabeth I. written to celebrate the accession of a very different Elizabeth, Elizabeth II, our current monarch here in the United Kingdom. As if you needed telling. But whereas her reign continues, mine, at least for this episode, is about to end. And not before time, I can hear you shout. And so to fend off those criticisms, let me bring it to a shuddering climax, if you'll pardon the expression, with the word that always does that. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk, edited and presented by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. Except for the songs, where the copyright of the performances remains with David William Hughes, and I'm extremely grateful to him for allowing me to play his songs in this episode. To find out more about the world of musical talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can at Musical Talk Thos.
I had a beer last night, so that wasn't too bad.
I think you're entitled to that.
Yeah.
I am now recording. Could you just briefly, very quickly, give me a level, if you wouldn't mind?
Yes, this is my normal voice
That's
sound.
pretty good. I'm going to come in a bit like that, but...
Okay, I can lean forward a bit. Yeah. Or I can...
Straight on's probably better,
Okay,
if you're happy
fantastic.
with that. And do feel free to slurp as I do.
Okay,
So.
I will slurp as we go along.
Now, you're going to think me the rudest man in the world, because I now need to run on.
Okay,
I've got another interview at about 11 o'clock, as it happens.
I'm going to be... Well, I've got a couple of hours for the show, so I'm going to go and chill out a bit, I think.
Well, I think you deserve it, if you don't mind me saying.